Biden's top military leaders had their feet held to the fire today on Capitol Hill, testifying for the first time in public about the chaotic end to the 20-year war in Afghanistan. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, and General Frank McKenzie, all leaders who have been on the ground in Afghanistan, were grilled by Democrats and Republicans on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Austin held the line that U.S. leaders were surprised at how quickly the Afghan army collapsed, and General Milley faced demands to resign. Take a listen.
The fact that the Afghan army that we and our partners trained simply melted away, in many cases without firing a shot, took us all by surprise, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise.
But if all this is true, General Milley, why haven't you resigned?
Resigning is a really serious thing, and it's a political act if I'm resigning in protest. My job is to provide advice. My statutory responsibility is to provide legal advice or best military advice to the president, and that's my legal requirement. Just from a personal standpoint, you know, my dad didn't get a choice to resign at Iwo Jima, and those kids there at Abbey Gate, they don't get a choice to resign. And I'm not going to turn my back on them. I'm not going to resign. They can't resign, so I'm not going to resign. There's no way.
General Milley also admitted that al-Qaeda and ISIS could very well rebuild a base in Afghanistan. In sum, the United States spent $8 trillion on the global war on terror, $3 trillion in Afghanistan alone, all to find the same Taliban leaders and the same terrorist group back in power 20 years later. Joining me now to discuss is former FBI double agent and Newsweek editor-at-large Naveed Jamali and senior advisor to the Black Veterans Project, Isiah James. Naveed, let's start with you. What did you make of the testimony today from military leaders?
You know, what I feel about this is no matter what we learn from these hearings, the war is over. And it's not going back. I know we still have the authority to use military force, and that is a conversation that needs to continue should we still have it in the books. But the reality is the war in Afghanistan is over. Yes, the Ghani government did not survive, but it is over. And that is, in my book, a positive thing that we should, you know, look, my kids and your kids are not going to have to worry about going to Afghanistan. I think that's a positive thing.
I am glad you said the word positive and not that is a win, because General Milley did make that statement today that you know, it was a tactical win but a strategic failure. Isiah, help us understand what that is supposed to mean.
That's one of those pay no attention to the man behind the curtain statements. It doesn't mean anything, a tactical win and a strategic failure, because out of the people here, I've been to Afghanistan. I was deployed to Iraq twice and Afghanistan once. And what we saw today was kabuki theater, because it was the generals who were perpetuating the war machine and all the members of Congress who were funding the war machine. And they're talking back and forth in front of each other just to placate the American people while our military is ramping up for another war somewhere else.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, the idea of kabuki theater and the war machine. And Naveed, you know, let's lean a little bit on your Navy experience here, which is this military-industrial complex and how it starts to feed in it of itself. We know that this counterterrorism message post 9/11 has consumed everything about law enforcement and the war machine. So where is it going to go next?
Well, I mean, look, all I got to say is Space Force. We spend $17.4 billion on Space Force, and I'm still not sure I understand what the hell they do. So there's always going to be a military-industrial complex. There's always going to be a bad guy that the military is gearing up, you know, to fight against. Absolutely right. And this is no different. What they call it in the military, the DOD, is they call it the pivot from the counterterrorism to peer adversaries, to counter China and Russia. And look, there is some legitimacy to that, but nonetheless, you know, military spending, the military machine goes on. We still do have a national security that we have to defend, but this is always going to be the top, you know, thing that we spend money on, and we're always going to be training young women and men to go fight wars. And if it's not Afghanistan or Iraq, it's going to be somewhere else. Of that we can be sure.
All right, so Isiah, is it inevitable though that we have to spend that much of the federal budget on the war machine. For example, if we were to look at the federal budget as a dollar bill, less than a penny, less than 1% is spent on all the humanitarian, diplomacy, building, all of those, good, positive, touchy-feely things. 25%, a full quarter of the federal budget is spent on the war machine. Everything else somehow becomes domestic spending. So, Isiah, is this actually inevitable?
I do not believe it's inevitable because our military spending was cut under President Clinton and ramped back up after 9/11. So I'm glad you brought that up because $755 billion is spent on our war machine. We spent 13 times more in defense spending than we do on just education spending in this country. So I don't think it's inevitable. What I think we need to do as a people, as citizens of this country, is to vote people in office who understand that a budget is not just what you spend money on. A budget is literally a manifestation of your priorities. And right now, the government that we have is telling people that we're prioritizing the war machine over, people in this country. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Don't tell me what you believe. Show me what you do, and I'll tell you what you believe."
And Naveed, this is where the rubber meets the road, because we do see that senators are afraid essentially to go up against the military-industrial complex. So what is going to convince them, the people in power, that building the next new fancy war machine in their district that may create jobs is not worth the trade-off it makes on our future?
Well, there's an important distinction here. So there's military spending and there's national security, right? So as Isiah is absolutely right. When we talk about military spending, we're talking about the Department of Defense. When we talk about national security, we're talking about the Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, and the Veterans Affairs, as well as the DOE. So when we look at this from a national security standpoint, are there things in the national security prism we should be spending on as opposed to, say, building new weapons? Absolutely. Diplomacy being one of them. But when it comes to actually, you're right, tamping down on building more bombers, building more guns. Our senators always going to vote for pork that goes in their district. Sadly, yes, it's something that we have to wean ourselves off of. Look, we're not fighting a war in Afghanistan and Iraq anymore. We don't need those kind of weapons, but it does mean we are going to have to spend on national security. So I would say that the better thing to focus on is things like diplomacy, which does fall under national security. We should be spending on that, because if we spend on that, we don't have to spend on military funding, hopefully.
Well, and that is the argument that several chairmen in previous administrations have made, which is if you give more money to fund the diplomats, you'll spend less money on ammunition. But I'm going to pin this for another time with both of you, whether or not the United States is actually done with war in Iraq and Afghanistan, because as we all know here, there are still activities going on that look like war and sound like war, but haven't officially been called that. But Naveed Jamali of Newsweek is the editor-at-large there. Isiah Jones, thank you both for joining me tonight.